Everybody here today. It's a pretty good turnout, and all the members of the board are very thankful for that. It is the 9th anniversary fundraising event, and I think you all know that this organization depends very much on money in order to do the things that it does in reporting abuses in the Horn of Africa. So I want to thank you all for appearing here today and contributing to the funds for the organization. You probably know that throughout the year you can also contribute through automatic transfers from your bank, and the method for doing that can be found at the website for the Human Rights League. Now, the other thing I want to do is to introduce our speaker for today. He is Felix Horn, who comes to us from the Human Rights Watch. Felix works for Human Rights Watch in Ottawa. He's a graduate master's degree from Dalhousie University. It was in another field, but working in that field, he worked on a project in Ethiopia and became acquainted with the situation over there. He's been with Human Rights Watch for 5 years, and I noticed that in the past 2 years, he's produced quite a number of short reports on the situation over there. So I'm very anxious to hear what he's going to tell us, and without any further comment, I'd like to welcome Felix Horn to our meeting today.
Thank you, Robert. So I'm not used to speaking for 45 minutes, so I have a very long time period to fill. But I'm also told that I speak quite fast. So if I'm speaking too fast, if somebody could just tell me to slow it down, because we have a lot of time.
5 minutes is for the speech, and maybe question will arise before.
Okay, yeah, I'd be quite happy to answer questions after. So I'm going to talk about 3 things. I want to give a little bit of an overview of what's happening right now in Oromia from the perspective of Human Rights Watch. I don't think this is going to be anything new for the people in this room. You know very well what's happening there with the protests and with the crackdown, but I would like to provide a summary of what we found in our research and our interviews with victims and with protesters. And then I'd like to talk a little bit about sort of access to information, how groups like ours get information, how decision makers, different governments get information, and what they do with that information, because I think that's very important. And then thirdly, I'd like to talk a little bit about how the Human Rights League Horn of Africa fits into that, and why this NGO is very important in terms of documenting what's happening on the ground in Oromia and throughout Ethiopia. So first to the protests. So Human Rights Watch has interviewed around 125 protesters, victims, perpetrators, witnesses to what's been happening since November of 2015. We've also interviewed, maybe 75 or so from the 2014 protests in Oromia. And these interviews are a couple of hours long. We also talked to several hundred other people, just for short discussions about what they see, what they saw, etc., etc. And those 125 interviews encompass around 70 different locations in Oromia. It was quite incredible to me when I think of the scale, the breadth of this protest movement. That right now we have documented around 600 individual protests within Oromia since November. I mean, that's mind-boggling to me. in a country where there's very little opportunity to protest, and those that do, of course, risk arrest or worse. And if we know about that many protests, how many protests are there out there that just aren't documented, that we don't know anything about? And it was striking to me as I did more and more of these interviews that every time we talked to somebody about a protest, that was, again, another new protest that we hadn't previously documented. There were just so many individuals from places whose voices had just not been heard by the outside world. So Human Rights Watch estimates that around 400 people have been killed. We don't say that with complete confidence. We're not on the ground. We can't document every killing that's happening. But the killings that we've been able to document, or where we feel there is a high likelihood, or the information that's out about the killing is quite credible, we feel is around 400. And of course, Garoma and Human Rights League Horn of Africa has documented many of those killings. We feel that tens of thousands have been detained throughout this protest. Thousands have disappeared. Obviously it's a major event in the history of Ethiopia and the history of the Horn of Africa. So what Human Rights Watch would do when we look at these protests is to try to identify patterns. What are the different patterns of behavior either by the security forces, the different types of abuses. And one thing that we've seen very clearly is that there's definitely a pattern in terms of how security forces are behaving on the streets of Oromia. In the first month or so, when it was mainly regional security forces, along with some federal police, we saw that excessive force was being used, tear gas was being used, the security forces were going in, beating protesters, there were mass arrests. But once the Prime Minister of Ethiopia went on the state-run television and basically announced that this was to be a military operation, things dramatically escalated on the streets. We saw military were present in most locations of Oromia, not all, but most. And then the regional security forces, who of course mostly ethnic Oromos, took a much less important role in handling the protests. So what we saw in the vast majority of the protests that we were able to document was the security forces used tear gas initially, and in the confusion that the tear gas brought up, live ammunition was used. Not in every protest, but in the vast majority. And in most of those cases, it was just complete indiscriminate firing. It was just sort of spraying of bullets into the crowds. And there was not any sort of targeted killings. It was not like that person there is somebody that we've been looking for, let's aim for him. It was just random spraying of bullets in the vast majority of locations. And of course, because young students were the ones that were most heavily involved in a lot of these protests, particularly in the early months, they were the ones that bore the brunt of this live ammunition, and we documented a lot of young students, including children, who were killed by security forces. We saw mass arrests. I think there's been lots of discussion about the arrests after protests. So during the chaos, during the tear gas, during the use of live ammunition, security forces, including regional security forces, were going around and arresting a variety of individuals. But we sort of have seen three main times when arrests were made. One was during those protests. The second was at night, and this came up a lot in interviews, where security forces, and it's usually a mix of federal police, the army, sometimes regional police, sometimes local police, would go door to door just looking for students, looking for people that were in that age bracket to be arrested. We documented a lot of cases where individuals who were harboring students were also arrested. We documented situations where parents were arrested because their students weren't home. Security forces were going to take their house. They knew that there was 4 children that lived there, and they weren't there, so they took the parents instead. So this sort of collective punishment, if you will, within different communities. And then the third category of arrest we saw was sort of the subsequent roundup. So after the protests had sort of subsided in any particular location, there was a very clear effort by security forces to round up what they saw as the most influential local Oromos. And some of the former security officials that we spoke with, because obviously some of them have also fled their posts, their jobs, told us that these lists were developed sometimes just through the local security office, sometimes in collaboration with the local government, and it was the best that were to be targeted. It was the those the teachers that had the ability to mobilize students to protest. It was the best students in the classes who again had that sort of influence over their classmates to protest further. It was musicians. I mean, everyone here knows about the power of our own music in order to mobilize over different issues. And of course, it was opposition politicians too, and that happened from the lowest levels. You know, those local opposition members who were quite influential, all the way up to the Beckley Gerbas of the Oromo world. The vast majority of those individuals that were arrested and that are still in detention have not been charged. Again, no one's looking very surprised at anything I'm saying here. They were not charged. They have not seen a lawyer. They have not seen a court. Very, very few of them have actually been charged. I mean, I think there's been a lot of attention on the charges under the anti-terrorism law from Michael Gerba and the other 21, is it? Individuals, OFC individuals. And obviously that's a very egregious set of charges for somebody that was such a staunch advocate for non-violence. And I mean, Human Rights Watch would believe that it's, for somebody that was so vocal about the need to resolve Oromo grievances through non-violent means, for him to be arrested and charged on the anti-terrorism law sends a terrible message to all those young children around the streets of Oromia, peacefully protesting. The other thing that came up in the interviews a lot was just the scale of these protests. I mean, everyone in this room knows that this happens every few years in Oromia. There's some sort of protest, there's some sort of crackdown from the government, there's lots of arrests, lots of fear is instilled into the population. But a lot of older Oromos that we spoke with said they had never seen anything quite like this. The scale of these arrests were unlike anything they had seen. And this we heard from a variety of different places, from all the zones of Oromia. We interviewed individuals from all the zones. So it seemed very, very widespread. I think there was one young girl, to me, just sort of summed up the scale of the crackdown within her community. She was a grade 8 student from RC. She said of 28 students in her class, there was only 4 left. 12 of them had been arrested, 1 had been killed by security forces, 4 had disappeared, and so on and so forth. And the first thing that struck me when I talked to her was that she was so committed to her education. That's what she wanted to do. She was very proud to be going to school. She took her studies very seriously. She had no appetite for politics whatsoever. She didn't seem terribly interested in the issues that students were protesting about, but she just wanted to go to school. And because of the protests and the resulting crackdown, she felt she was no longer able to do that. Her teacher had also been arrested. Because the protests had been quite vociferous in her community, the teacher was blamed for that. So he had been arrested. And so no classes were happening, period. The detentions, the vast majority of detentions that we documented were quite short. There was usually some form of mistreatment, usually sort of beatings with sticks and the like, but certainly not like some of the sort of really horrible torture that we documented in different places in detention in Oromia. Now, obviously, we're only speaking to those individuals that have been released from detention. We're not speaking to those that are still in detention, because we don't have that access either. Criminal charges, I mentioned Beckley Gerba. There's been some other opposition party members, like from the Blue Party, that have also been charged for their comments on social media about the protests. We've also seen students that protested in front of the U.S. Embassy in Addis Ababa that were charged under the criminal code, not under the anti-terrorism law, but under the criminal code, and they face up to 3 years for what's very clearly a peaceful protest. I mean, you can see the entire video on YouTube or Facebook. In fact, that was actually cited as evidence in the charge sheet. I think, in addition to sort of these egregious rights violations that I'm speaking about, this has also had a massive impact on education and healthcare. And I mean, a lot of the students that we interviewed were in Ethiopia at the time of the interview. A lot weren't. A lot had decided to flee, made a difficult decision to flee Oromia. But what really struck me is how so many of these kids, they felt they had no choice. Schools were closed for long periods of time. Teachers were arrested. The students who either led the protests within the schools or were accused of leading the protest were suspended from school, were arrested. A number of students were released on the condition that they not go back to school. And some of the administrators that we talked to said, some said that, yeah, I mean, that's clear, we're going to punish those individuals who organize protests, but not allowing them to complete their education. Other administrators say, well, no, it's more practical than that. It's just because they missed so many classes that they can't possibly do their national exams because they were in detention for so long. And so next year, they will be allowed to come back to school. Regardless, the school has been massively interrupted. We've also heard from a number of teachers who, after the protests, reported plainclothes intelligence officers in their classrooms, monitoring students. Some make it very obvious that they're with the security organs. Others don't, but it's sort of obvious when someone doesn't speak a Oromo and who's 45 years old and no one's seen them before, is in a grade 3 classroom. And of course, you can imagine that sort of the impact that has on learning and the ability of students to speak up and openly discuss issues of the day. We've also seen it has a lot of impact on healthcare. A lot of health workers were targeted. In some cases, for doing the arms crossed, the symbol of their own protest, doing that on social media. There were a lot of health workers that were arrested because of that. We also documented cases where health workers were targeted because they were seen as giving health care to wounded protesters. In some cases, security officials who'd also been injured during the arrests, or during the protests, went into the health clinics to get treatment and told them to treat them first and not treat some of the injured protesters. And at least in one case, one of those students died from the injuries while he was waiting to be treated. So these are things that we don't have a lot of leverage points on the Ethiopian government, but education, healthcare, etc., is funded by the Western world in many cases. So these are sort of places where we could be applying some pressure. I think for me, the Oromo protests, and we'll get to some good news in a little while here. The Oromo protests to me are a very good example of how there's just no ability within which to peacefully express dissent in Ethiopia. And this is one of our constant messages to governments, is that if you give individuals no outlet to express dissent, I mean, we all have concerns, whatever country we live in, we need to have ways to be able to express that peacefully. And when you don't, that creates a very dangerous situation where the pressures, the tension builds up within a country until it potentially explodes, something that nobody wants to see. So if in Ethiopia, in Oromia specifically, but in Ethiopia generally, we don't see any place to express that dissent. There's no real independent media that can cover the types of events that we've seen in Oromia the last 6 months. I'll talk more about this in a little while. There's very little in the way of independent civil society that can perhaps take your concerns and bring them to the attention of decision makers. We see the elections. There's no opposition politicians. It's 100% EPRDF. Not only in the federal system, but also in all of the regional systems. That's a massive problem. If you have a concern, if let's say your land has been taken from you, what recourse do you have? You can't go to the courts. The courts have shown very little independence in politically sensitive cases. They're not bad in criminal cases, just independent there, but not on politically sensitive cases. So there's just nowhere to really express dissent. So when we think about an Oromo farmer who's been displaced, let's say from the area around Addis Ababa, as has been happening for 10 years, what do they do? I mean, here we are where hundreds and thousands of people have been taken to the streets over the master plan, and of course other issues too. And a lot of decision makers around the world were like, well, why are they taking the streets over a master plan? Why is this such a big deal? Why haven't we heard about this displacement before? It's because there's no way for people to express those sorts of problems. And they can't do it through the courts. They haven't been able to do it through the electoral process. They haven't been able to do it through the media, through civil society. So what do you have left? Well, you have taking to the streets. You have protests, and that's what's happened. Usually, when there's protest movements like this in Ethiopia, as you know, the government uses a variety of techniques to silence people. It can be, they're very good at instilling fear in populations. You know, they can make targeted arrests, arresting leaders, high-profile leaders, organizers of the protest.